of Ronald Tallon's house, Goulding House, which he designed and was constructed in 1975, a house which you can see from some of the photographs is now somewhat neglected. This house focuses on a now past period in Ireland when a number of architects were seemingly influenced by work in America, more particularly in the United States, and particularly by the work of Mies van der Rohe. Nowadays, one might say that a younger generation of architects, some of whom worked in the office of Scott Tallon Walker, have looked towards mainland Europe in their approaches, manifest, for example, in various projects in Temple Bar. Certainly, one's impression of Ireland as an outsider is that its affiliation to continental Europe has strengthened. What seems intriguing is that a number of buildings could have been constructed in Ireland in the 1960s and 70s, which ostensibly owe to a North American modernism in such a, shall we say, unfettered or undigested way. Now, these include such projects as the science laboratories at St Columba's School by Robin Walker and the Carroll Cigarette Factory by Ronald Tallon and the RTE Administration Building in Dublin. To what extent was a Miesian tradition pursued in reality? If one considers this question in a number of other European countries, the effect of what one might describe in Kenneth Frampton's words as critical regionalism is more overt. In North Italy, for example, in the work of the late 50s and 60s, one is also aware of manipulations wrought somehow by the weight of earlier traditions, manifest, for example, in mannerism and Baroque. So, for example, in the work of BBPR in Milan, or in the work of Nervi in Turin, in the grandiose eponymous ramp in the Fiat factory, or Nervi's dendriform columns in his exhibition hall, one never feels far from the Baroque master Guarini. To what extent are these works, the works of this period in Irish architecture, a modern expression of Ireland? Now, John Olley, who is, I'm pleased to introduce, will be giving this lecture, I believe will comment critically on how far this influence really went. And certainly in our studies, or I should say the students' studies of the Goulding House, they have already discovered the anomalies between what was intended and the actual mode of construction. So may I now introduce John Olley. Thank you.
Okay, switch that off. Right. Well, I'm pleased to be back in this room giving a lecture. It wasn't an evening lecture, it was just in the run-of-the-mill teaching, but it was something like 20 years ago, not long after this building was built. First of all, I just want to introduce you to the building if you haven't already been to the bar, as I have, in order to steady my nerves. The building, as Ros says, was built in 1975, and it's called the Goulding House. It's really more the Goulding Room, or the Goulding Party Room. It is built in their back garden, which is quite extensive. Their house is the other side of the river, which is down below. The Gouldings, well, it was Sir Basil Goulding, obviously Anglo-Irish, if Irish at all. And the function of this room was to be a party room, but also perhaps to provide a service at a price for executives, somewhere where you can take your business friends and impress them in the drama of the location. This building was used as that, and it has been used for other things. It became a restaurant, and most recently, before it fell into decay, it was used by Dorothy Cross, the sculptress. And its most recent past is a hangout for junkies and winos. And they are attributed with the damage that's been created. So there it is, in its pristine state, and on the right today. And again, similar views. What perhaps isn't clear from the photographs upstairs, that the room itself, or the house, is not the only part of the design, because we see on the landward side, as it were, some strange objects. This was an ornamental pool with islands. It was part of the partying enclosure when the weather permitted. And this is what remains. All the pools are dry, and there is the remains of an umbrella-like enclosure for the barbecue. So it was conceived in terms of enjoyment, a kind of pleasure pavilion. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the hang of which side is which. The Gouldings. Sir Basil has passed away, and Lady Goulding is still alive, but very ill. And I was hoping before I stood up to talk about this building that I might know a bit more about the context in which it was built. Why Scott Tallon Walker were employed, why they built it, where they built it, how come they had so much daring to commission such a building. Unfortunately, Lady Goulding had agreed to an interview, and then later, because of her the severeness of her illness, she declined. So I'm coming at it, as it were, from the outside. A lot of what I'm going to say is perhaps circumstantial. There is a network of coincidences or connections. And the first starts perhaps on the left here. This is the Farnsworth House, and sitting on the terrace there is the new owner of the Farnsworth House, a collector of monuments of 20th century domestic architecture, Palumbo, a developer. The Goulding House, now belongs to a new owner, who is also a developer. And at the moment, it stands as a kind of 20th century ruin, as a folly in his garden. And if I just perhaps go back on this side. Right, there is the real house. At present, he is building a bridge across the river, a suspension bridge, and extending the house in perhaps quite a bizarre way, with a massive extension, which is just the bedroom with jacuzzi, a thatched roof, terraces on different levels, elaborate railings, etc., looking out towards this perhaps ruined folly of the 20th century in his acquired landscape. So perhaps this developer sees himself as the new Palumbo, a collector of, well, maybe just Irish icons of the 20th century. But there is another connection between Palumbo and the Farnsworth House, and it is because the architect of the Goulding House, Ronald Tallon, built his own version of the Farnsworth House out in Fox Rock, a suburb of Dublin, collecting his own by building, as it were, copies or versions. If our developer wanted to make a collection of the icons of Irish 20th century domestic architecture, he missed one recent opportunity, the acquisition of this building on the left, which is Michael Scott's house in Sandy Cove, on the coast, just south of Dunleary, which is just south of Dublin. Scott, of course, was the founder of the architectural practice Scott Tallon Walker, Tallon being, with Robin Walker, one of the younger generations to form this practice. One of the bright young talented men that Scott had an eye for collecting in order to push forward his campaign for introducing and keeping alive modern architecture in Ireland. Michael Scott, in fact, saw himself as the bringer of modernism to Ireland, at least architecturally. He achieved most of this by his personality rather than his pencil, and the quality of the practice's buildings perhaps owe more to other younger, talented pencil pushers. He was an outgoing person, able to persuade people to build what was seen by most as outrageous. He had a keen eye to recruit talent. He was perhaps himself a bit of an exhibitionist. His house, right by the sea, with the two bay windows, one of the sitting room and the bedroom above, don't enjoy the views of the sea except to the side, but look to the coastline, which means that as you walk along the coastline, there is the Gera house and its main rooms revealed to all. He was in fact an actor before he became an architect, and in a way he has produced his stage to act out his life of promotion of the arts and architecture. Ronald Tallon, the architect of the Goulding house, was one of the bright young things. But another bright young thing was Kevin Roche, who ultimately made his name in America. It seems that Kevin Roche was quite prominent in the design of Scott Tallon, Michael Scott's perhaps most notorious and best building, which is Busaras, the bus station in central Dublin. Kevin Roche left Dublin to work in America for Eero Saarinen. And he eventually took over that practice with Dinkaloo to form the current partnership on Saarinen's death. Saarinen was Finnish. His father had promoted Romantic classicism in Finland in the 19th and early 20th century. That was part of Finland's attempt to assert its national identity. It is also kind of coincidental that Finland gained a long sought after independence just before Ireland. Both independences were followed by a brief civil war. A coincidence, maybe. Saarinen appears in American design, associated here in this image with Charles and Ray Eames. As part of a burgeoning interest in a new domestic architecture in the Los Angeles area, promoted by the magazine Arts and Architecture. And we might note here the form of the first proposition, which later became the Eames House as we know it, which was somewhat altered before it was built, as you can see. So there is this amazing link here that is part of this network of circumstantial links. But this house was designed in 1945, 30 years before the Goulding House. And this is the result, eventually, of the realization of the project, which suddenly changed direction. And according to Ray Eames, it's because Charles suddenly changed his mind, thinking about the amount of steel which was required to build that cantilevered structure, discovered the same amount of steel, if the house was rooted on the ground, could provide for a much larger area. And ultimately, they opted for that. The building, as I said, the Goulding House, became a restaurant. And it was in this restaurant in 1983 that Kevin Roach was entertained to a special dinner to mark his winning of the Pritzker Prize. And there was also an associated exhibition of his work in Dublin. Kevin Roach has finally reappeared on the Dublin architectural scene as the author of a project not very far from Bucyrus, of megalomaniacal proportions. It is the Spencer Dock development, which I think finally has been refused planning permission. Its scale is of the order of nothing that Dublin has seen before. The developers involved in the Spencer Dock development, Treasury Properties, and prominent in them is the owner of the Goulding House, Johnny Rowlands. So things come back again. Kevin Roach was born in 1922, which of course is the year of the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses. James Joyce didn't bring modernism in literature to Ireland. He took it away with him and created it somewhere else. And of course, this brings us back to Scott's house, Gera, which we can see in an aerial view on the right. We can see its location. On this curving sea wall, and just behind it is a Martello Tower. That Martello Tower is a scene for the opening pages of Joyce's Ulysses. And today, much to the promotion of Michael Scott, is a small museum to James Joyce. Sorry. Scott claimed that he brought modernism in architecture to Ireland. And perhaps the way he did it was in his role on the committee of the Irish version of the Architectural Association. The Architectural Association in Ireland, which is really a society to promote interest in architecture, and is not an architectural school. As his role he invited, or encouraged the president to invite, eminent architects. And he brought, or should I say, took Walter Gropius to Dublin. In an interview not long before his death, Michael Scott, in conversation with Dorothy Walker, the wife or the widow of Robin Walker, of Scott Tallon Walker, recalls this event. And I'm sorry I left the book back in Dublin, so I'll have to paraphrase what he said. He said that he was a great friend with Walter Gropius, that he wined and dined him. He took him out to Glendalough in the Wicklow Mountains, and he took him around Dublin. Walter Gropius was shown this building on the left here. Sorry, he wasn't shown that building on the left, but a similar building by the same architect, Sims. Walter Gropius was appalled. He had never seen anything so terrible. So Michael Scott agreed. And he described Sims as that little Englishman with a moustache who committed suicide, and it's not surprising, building stuff like that. But what this represents, these apartment buildings, is the filtration of modernism, or part of modernism, to Ireland through Britain. It is an image, greatly watered down, of the Amsterdam school's housing, but without the underpinning of the social system, the way it was procured, and the management system. These flats were the possession and financed by Dublin Corporation, where the residents had no say in the maintenance, its form, and the facilities. So some modernism has appeared in Ireland as an image rather than a reality. Walter Gropius went to Dublin in 1937. It was the same year as Scott designed Gera. Sometime earlier, back in the year that Joyce published Ulysses and Kevin Roche was born, a prominent politician addressed the Architecture Association of Ireland, Darrell Figgis. It was a looking forward, now that Ireland had gained independence, how they were going to build for the future, what the identity was going to be. And in this address, which was subsequently published, as we can see here, he says, first of all, we must cleanse our minds of imitation. It seems that his words were not heeded. And in disengaging ourselves of antique manners, bring our work to simplicity and truth, shaping each building to necessity, and look for beauty in chastity and proportion. That is the task before all Irish art, and it is especially the task before Irish architecture. He went on to say that there perhaps shouldn't be an Irish style. This would consist of architectural falsehoods, of imitations. He then asked, is there a national type of architecture? I reply that our ancient manner may have been lost, and for all I care, it may be irrecoverable. But it is not important to remember that we once had a distinctive manner of our own building, of our own in the handling of architectural problems. So if modernism wasn't making its way, or didn't have a manifestation in the cultural move towards independence, nothing equivalent to Joyce's Ulysses, nothing equivalent to the vibrancy of the Abbey Theatre. But it was within the minds of the politicians. Why didn't it happen? I suppose the easy explanation is, or the usual explanation is, because of the economic state that Ireland was in, and because of the privations of the fight for independence and the subsequent civil war. It might be more to do with the architectural profession, who were highly conservative, probably Anglo-Irish in their tendencies, and this would not engender a looking to Europe for the latest developments in architecture. It would wait for a younger generation to move, to look for fresh ideas, to look for a heroic future for this new country. But in a way, Ireland wasn't without some modern architecture. And it came in the generation of facilities for the country on a heroic scale. And perhaps one of the most notable monuments to this period is the hydroelectric scheme at Ardnacrusha on the Shannon, which involved building several kilometres of canal in order to create a sufficient head to drive the turbines. And here we see a view of down that canal, making a massive intervention in the landscape. The modernism of it is within the structures of the dams, holding back the water, preparing it to then plunge over the dam through the pipes into the turbine, down into the turbine building, through the turbines. But looking at that turbine building, it looks a bit peculiar, a bit strange. Going around the other side, this doesn't look like the heroic modernism of the dam construction. This looks much more like something from Bavaria, which is more or less precisely what it is. The company who got the commission for this feat of engineering was Siemens. And the form of this building, the turbine house, is very similar to hydroelectric schemes that were designed and built in Bavaria around the turn of the century. But still within government, there were people with an eye to what is possible in the building of the new state. The Minister of Local Government and Public Health, Sean O'Kelly, in 1933 addressed not the Architectural Association of Ireland, but the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland. He says, "Without wishing to enter what I know is debatable ground or get mixed up in the controversy that rages between old and new, or tradition and functional architecture, I would remind these young students that some of the striking architectural triumphs of modern times have been achieved by the smaller nations. Alvar Aalto, the Finn, who won the competition for the sanatorium we see here a few years ago with a design of startling originality and has since achieved European fame, first set up on his own in a town of only 6,000 people and is still in his 30s. We too in this country have room for men who will give our peculiar problems the intense study they require and help us build in a manner that will reflect credit on our country and generation." So what happened in Finland was, in a way, something similar. A look towards what was happening outside and a younger generation bringing it back to Finland to become part of their identity as a new, a young and progressive state. These words could well be the inspiration for Michael Scott, because as well as Gropius, Michael Scott brought another architect of international repute to lecture to the Architectural Association. That was Eric Mendelsohn, who was then in Britain. Mendelsohn lectured at the AA shortly before Michael Scott designed his house, Gera. And one might suspect that following this visit was the inspiration for this early drawing of Gera on the left here by Michael Scott. Perhaps a rather stiff version of the types of drawings that Mendelssohn would do here of his building in Bexhill-on-Sea. But maybe there we have the inspiration for Michael Scott's version of modernism. Again, maybe it's just the image which is coming in, borrowed perhaps in quite a raw form. If you look at the plan of Gera, and I'll just point out if I can get this thing to work. This is the understory. Out here is the open sea. Towards here is the shoreline of the bay, of Dublin Bay. The entrance is here, takes you up the stairs here and arriving at, this is not quite the state it's in at the moment, an open area here, which is the dining room, which moves out onto this terrace. The kitchen and the services are located here, and round here into the sitting room, and above that the master bedroom, looking out over the bay. Over here is another project for a building from the 30s, where we have a sitting room, we have a dining room here, the stairs coming up behind it, the services there, and a terrace in front of the dining room. The angle there is identical to this. I've cheated a bit, this is back to front. But this is, again, perhaps just a coincidence. This is an unbuilt design by Sharoon. But it wasn't only Scott who was building, or perhaps who was inspired by the lectures by Gropius and Mendelssohn. There are other buildings. This one, a little further south. Gera is just down around about here on the coastline. This is up on the hill, looking out now over the sea from these windows on the other side, facing out to the sea to gain the view, not towards the gathered audience. In the late 30s, there were a number of buildings which seemed to represent, at last, the arrival of some kind of modernism. And that modernism was not dissimilar to a modernism in Britain, which was greatly promoted by Mendelssohn, which is often referred to as modern, meaning that it's really just the image and not the form. So what Ireland is getting is another watered-down version of what is happening in Britain. It is strange. There is a sudden burst in the late 30s of building of these white houses. In fact, where these two houses are is along a street which is a development of these modern houses out at Foxrock, not far from where Ronald Tallon was to build his version of the Farnsworth House. But there was another building which is perhaps represents the arrival of modernism, and perhaps in a way much more elegant, and taking on board modernism and perhaps the story that Mendelssohn was telling the AA, and that is the airport, the old airport in Dublin, built by the Office of Public Works, but taking a leading role in the design was the architect Fitzgerald, only just out of college. It's that younger generation being inspired by modernism happening in Britain. This was begun in 1937, and the building went on until 1941. It wasn't published because of the Second World War, and because of its the importance of the building type as an airport. So this building was not revealed to the world until after the war. But let us take off from there in a plane. A plane which has two cantilevers, or in this case, three cantilevers, double story, hanging out over the water. That technology, that idea of structure, was well understood before we get to the Goulding House. And another illustration from Corb's Vers une Architecture. With struts, cross-braced, producing this double cantilever. And let's fly westwards to America. And we will arrive, the right button, at Los Angeles. With a remarkable similarity with Dublin Airport. But this drawing of Los Angeles is dated 1945. But it's convenient, and it's another one of these coincidences, that this takes us to that site where we met Saarinen and Eames designing a house for a hillside, cantilevered, standing on stilts. But it's also where we might find that typology because of the landscape, because of the stupendous possibility of views out over the sea. There we find Frank Lloyd Wright is looking out over nature with structures which cantilever out from the hillside, but not in steel. But we enter a domain where the steel frame house became a local craft, as it were, greatly promoted by the Arts and Architecture magazine, and also another émigré from Germany, from Austria, Richard Neutra. And leading on to others like Craig Elwood, who took up the mantle of exploring the possibilities of steel frame buildings standing on the hillsides to provide a stupendous view over the landscape, which is the building on the right. And here, somewhat later, the early 60s, some buildings by Neutra, standing there on their stilts, looking out over the landscape, built in steel and steel frame, and there we can see its form. Not as a truss, as the Saarinen and Eames design, but as a series of beams to create a platform on which you build a building. Craig Elwood did a number of versions of steel frame buildings, those that cantilevered out, those that were bridges, such as the one that we see here, which looks again rather reminiscent of the Goulding House, but here bridging across a ravine rather than cantilevering out. And there is its idealized site. He also did a version sitting in the water, another bridge, a box, essentially a bridge-like structure, stood on its pads in the water. Almost as if Ronald Tallon had forgot the other half. Sailing out from one bank as if to reach the other, but never getting there. If we perhaps compare the plans, there is again a similarity. The entrance through a core of the services, quite close to the entrances, moving through to the living room beyond. And there, another one of his, the other bridge house, the one sitting in the water, again with the same party. The practice of Scott Tallon Walker was established with the two younger members of Scott's practice, Ronald Tallon, the Goulding house on the left, and Robin Walker, who built the Flaherty house on the right there. Robin Walker had first explored the new architecture by going to the horse's mouth. He first went and worked for Le Corbusier. Then he thought he would try America, and he went and studied and worked with Mies van der Rohe. So the Flaherty house could be seen as a kind of fusion of those two masters. But Mies and his precision and ordering was what was to dominate. So we get direct contact now with some of the masters of 20th century architecture, where Irish architects go out to America to work for Mies van der Rohe. Robin Walker was not the only one. He was followed by the younger Cathal O'Neill, who later became the head of the School of Architecture at University College Dublin and recently retired, and also the late Peter Doyle. So now there becomes this fresh input of influences, which becomes perhaps a revitalization of Scott Tallon Walker's attempt to keep modernism alive in Ireland. Ronald Tallon didn't go to work for Mies, but he was greatly influenced. In fact, sold to Mies entirely, and perhaps, unlike Robin Walker, there is less of that digestion of Mies's ideas into something which is created locally in Ireland, an interpretation of Mies within the Irish context. Here, Crown Hall, juxtaposed with one of Ronald Tallon's buildings for the RTE, the Irish Radio and Television Authority. And that brings us to perhaps Ronald Tallon's most important building and most accomplished building, the Carroll's Cigarette Factory in Dundalk, which, built in the late 50s, early 60s, is a remarkable piece to find its way into conservative Ireland. So why, in a way, was there this gap? The answer might be something to do with the economy. Why did those white boxes disappear? Why did there appear to be this regression? It may be the economy, but it might be the political situation. Fianna Fáil, under Eamon de Valera, gained control of government. And in his St. Patrick's Day speech in 1943, he said, "The island which we have dreamed of would be the home of people who valued material wealth only as a basis of right living, of a people who were satisfied with frugal comfort and devoted their leisure to things of the spirit, a land whose countryside would be bright with cosy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contests of athletic youths, the laughter of comely maidens, whose firesides would be the forums for the wisdom of serene old age. It would, in a word, be the home of people living life that God desired that men should live. That kind of sentiment doesn't seem to be that which could promote an embracing of modernism. It seems to look back to an idealized island, a rural island, living in perhaps slightly improved cottages, but shunning anything to do with the city and the progress of the rest of Europe and America. And it promoted the isolationist situation of Ireland economically and perhaps culturally. And so it was only when we get this emigration of young architects to search out an alternative to this folksy view of an identity for Ireland. There's Crown Hall with the interior of the Carroll cigarette factory at Dundalk. Another building, the Bank of Ireland, by Ronald Tallon, and with photographs here by John Donor, looking out from the foyer across Baggot Street. And there seems to be a kind of disjuncture between the ultra-modern and what you see out the window with the old lady walking a dog. So this seems to be quite a recurrent theme in the building industry in Ireland. Anachronistic juxtapositions, haymaking on the field of the airport, quite primitive ways of making quite progressive structures. For the bus station, again by Michael Scott. The Goulding house itself was to a certain extent ad hoc in the same way. It was built by direct labour. Sir Basil and his gardener did a lot of the work. The gardener did the timber work of the platform and the timber sidings. It was something that had to be improvised, and a lot of the fabrication was actually done on site, even though the image is one of an industrialized building. So Ronald Tallon had swallowed the influence of Mies van der Rohe. We have been talking about the Goulding house, though, in terms of the hillsides of Los Angeles and that emerging tradition of building in steel, of Craig Elwood, of Richard Neutra, and of Eames. But he was true to his hero. On the right we see a 1934 sketch for a weekend house by Mies van der Rohe. So again, Ronald Tallon is doing a version of his hero's architecture. So how am I doing for time? I just want to try and take a diversion here and talk about the structure of the building. The other buildings that we have been looking at, I'm sorry, could you put on the slide on the right? I'll just go back. If we look at Mies's sketch, we have a structure which is partially cantilevered on the hillside like that. If we look at Ronald Tallon's version, we have something like this. This is much more daring in its cantilevering form, stretching out much further. But in fact, it denies a kind of efficient logic of the structure. It is pushing it beyond the realms of efficient use of material. So, just to take you, sorry, I focus this. If we take something simple like a beam and we put a load on it, it's its own weight, then it will tend to bend, and there will be a bending moment that looks something like that. The maximum bending moment will be in the center, the maximum deflection will be in the center. If we now change the support of this beam, and we place the supports there, what we will get is something a little different. Something like that. That here, in the center, the beam sags, on the outside it curves over. But what is actually happening is that the degree of bending moment, the stress on the material, is being reduced in the center by overhanging it. So by changing the structure slightly, we're reducing the stresses on that structure and therefore reducing the quantity of material which is required to carry that stress. So if we go back to Mies's sketch here, then by cantilevering this out a little bit, it's actually helping this part of the structure, relieving the stress. Also relieving the degree of deflection. But if we do this, what we're doing is going beyond that, where this, in fact, is increasing the stress in this area, increasing the bending moment, because the level of cantilever is, the length of cantilever is so long. But also, within the plan of the Goulding house, we have the entrance and a service zone there, and then the main part of the house, of the room, where everybody will congregate, looking out over the ravine. We're putting the maximum load at the point which is going to put maximum stress on the structure. So in fact, it's counter to a kind of structural logic. It becomes a kind of daring, I suppose, to stretch beyond the limits. What it does mean is that the forces and stresses are maximized, the deflection of this part and the movement of this part of the building is maximized. So in order to make a structure that will withstand the partying horde, we need more material, which means the members of the structure, of that bridge-like structure, get larger and begin to move away from that clear line that Mies would have conceived, where the structure is fined down and becomes the elegant box. So by that move of daring, pushing it out, there is a loss of that elegance of the Miesian sketch because of the size of the members. And could we go back to the slides now, please? Switch this up. So that sheer daring has introduced its own problems, has increased the size of the structural members of the frame, reducing its light, elegant form. It also means that the structure is liable to greater deflection, and in fact, the building moves quite unnervingly. And if you imagine, in its days of a restaurant, every time the waiter comes out, you go bounce up and down. So looking from the interior, we see here, those thicker members begin to interfere with the reason for stretching out over the ravine to see the landscape. And if you compare it with Neutre's house on a hillside, it is there to take you out to this end of this cantilever to see the landscape. And Here it's out on a balcony. Sorry, this is perhaps the nature of the structure of the Goulding house. Something which is comfortable to sit in, but not so comfortable to be a building jumping up and down. Also, Frank Lloyd Wright was doing the same, cantilevering out over the hillside to look out towards the sea. And that's what Mies was doing in the Farnsworth House that Ronald Tallon had copied. But the Goulding house, as well as increasing its structural members' size to interfere with the view, he pushes you out, and where the structure, the crossbars are not required, you're actually right against the other side of the bank. And perhaps the most dramatic view would be out of the side of the building. But it's also something that Craig Elwood did, as it were, to cross out the view by the structure. So looking down here to the ravine is where the dramatic view is, on one side and on the other. But maybe there's another view of what a building might be, not as a diagram, not as an intellectual idea, not as a structure, but as Earl Brown has said, he prefers to think of form as the result of activity in relationship to a labyrinth of implications rather than as a fixed configuration. That kind of idea is also reflected in Henri Lefebvre's writings. He says, "This modern space is the space of blank sheets of paper, drawing boards, plans, sections, elevations, scale models, geometric projections. It forgets that space does not consist of projections of an intellectual representation, does not arise from the visible, readable realm, but that it is, first of all, heard, listened to, and enacted through physical gestures and movement." So with all this daring, that stupendous sighting over this deep ravine with this torrent of water rushing beneath is something that you are isolated to, that the winos and junkies have re-engaged us with by breaking the glass, the only way to open the windows, to let you hear the building and its site. There is another coincidence. And perhaps a potential within this way of building. Lady Goulding was not inactive. She was promoting good causes. She founded what's called the Central Remedial Clinic, an institution to educate, to improve the quality of life for the severely disabled. In fact, the party room was instrumental in that. Parties were held as part of the sponsorship. The garden was open on Sundays for an admission fee. She was providing for the severely disabled. It's just unfortunate that with such a building, it is possible to get access, level access, in a wheelchair, so that those that she cared for in the Central Remedial Clinic could have joined the festivities within the building, could have been taken out and looked down on that torrent. But unfortunately, the step is still there, but needn't be. So this icon is perhaps an icon of the past. And there is a new agenda for architecture today, where the person returns and the intellectual diagram recedes. But maybe there are lessons in this building. Maybe there are potentials. If the windows opened, you could look out onto the view. You could breathe the air. You could hear the torrent. You could hear the birds singing in the trees and the rustling leaves. You could also certainly get in there in a wheelchair, as today it has been possible with with the reconstruction of your ramp outside. So I think maybe I shall end with a quotation from Oscar Wilde, which is perhaps where architecture in Ireland is going. It is finding its identity. He says, "It is only by contact with art of foreign nations that the art of a country gains that individual and separate life that we call nationality." Thank you. Asleep. I had one last slide, I think, so maybe you could, which in a way is a call for help, that no matter what one thinks of this building, it does represent a moment and an evolution of Irish architecture. And bearing in mind that it is, if I can find the slide, now belongs to a developer, that maybe this developer should not be told about the links with Los Angeles and the potential for the steel frame building. And I'll leave you with this image on the right here, which is a development in Los Angeles Hills of a suburb of steel-framed, cantilevered houses. So with such a large garden, he could, in such a beautiful location, make more money to build a more lavish thatched cottage the other side of the valley. So I think there is a cause for some concern of whether this building will be restored and whether the beauty of its location will be retained. Okay, thank you.
Well, perhaps if there are no questions, then we can retire to the bar and talk about it informally.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you.